All right. Thank you for logging on to today's webinar, Catching Crisis, How Affect Effusions Affect Us All. We are starting now. Thank you. Thanks again for joining us. My name is Marla Kaufman, and I am the Communication and Health Promotion Associate at IRETA. I will be moderating our webinar today. I would like to go over some quick housekeeping items about how to use WebEx and how to access the continuing education credits. First, we would like to encourage you all to participate in today's webinar through a few ways. If you have questions for our presenter or are experiencing any technical difficulties, please use either the chat function or the Q&A panel to communicate your questions. Our presenter, Caren Sumption, will take, is it Sumption or Sumption?
No, it's Sumption. It's phonetic.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. We'll answer questions at the end of the webinar. Feel free to submit your questions through the chat or Q&A box at any time. This webinar is approved for 1 PCB and/or NADAC credits, which are free. A certificate of attendance will also be available to download from your MyIRETA account. Please note that it will take up to 48 hours for your CEUs and certificate to be available in your MyIRETA profile because we have to cross-check your attendance with WebEx following the webinar. After the webinar, you will receive a follow-up email. This email will include a link to an evaluation form for the webinar, as well as more information on how to access your certificate of attendance and continuing education credits. We may send you an additional email to remind you of the evaluation. I would now like to introduce today's presenter. Caren Sumption is a lead advocate at the DV Hopeline, a 24/7 line in King County serving survivors of domestic violence and intimate partner violence, their supporters, and social service professionals. Specializing in culturally competent crisis intervention, Caren is a certified peer specialist, national civilian victim advocate, community health worker, and CCAR recovery coach. Okay, Caren, I will pass things over to you.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Marla. Hi, everybody. I'm Caren. I'm going to just jump in to the presentation, which I've called Catching Crisis, How Affect Effusions Affect Us. This presentation grew out of my work basically in crisis. The work that I do at the DV Hopeline, we do kind of function similarly to a crisis line, and most of my previous experience were in crisis triage, either in person, frontline crisis triage, or delivered via telephone or text. And one thing that I brought to my work, particularly on the DV Hopeline, was some techniques for managing some very natural things that occur based on our brains, that occur when you're serving folks that are in crisis. And so this kind of developed out of that. It's not something we talk about a lot as service providers, and we really should. So my email is right on the front slide. If you have any questions that don't get answered in the Q&A at the end, feel free to reach out to me. I am happy to answer anything or follow up on anything that you have questions on. So again, as Marla said, I'm lead advocate at the DV Hopeline. This is just for those of you coming in late. It's a little bit more about me. This will also be available, the whole deck actually will be available as a PDF if you're interested. So today's agenda, I wanted to keep it really simple. So we're going to be able to define and identify affect infusions, including social referencing and emotional contagion. Those are two of the ones that I work with a lot of my advocates on specifically. Understand some of the ways in which affect effusions impact our interactions with clients that are in crisis. Identify ways to manage affects if infusions in a crisis moment when we're working with folks. And then just review some self-care techniques to help prevent these affect infusions from intruding in your work. So just to start out with, I like to always define my terms. Just a little bit about crisis. How do we define crisis? So I kind of went with a very general definition of a crisis and how a crisis tends to move. There's an event that precipitates the crisis. Something happens to somebody. The person has a perception of this event, whatever it is, that causes a feeling of distress. That distress, it could be fear, it could be anger, but it causes some sort of sense of distress. That distress reduces their ability to cope with the events. Their usual current coping mechanisms are failing them. And that causes them to feel hopeless, even angrier, scared, and that's when they enter into a feeling of crisis. Here's the thing. So when I'm talking about crisis, the event that precipitates the crisis, it doesn't matter. So whether you're working with clients that have severe and persistent mental health issues, whether they're SUD clients, whether they're domestic violence, intimate partner survivors, it doesn't really matter what the precipitating event. The important thing that we address, of course, in our work is the feelings that these events bring out. A crisis emerges when somebody can't use their coping mechanisms and don't feel like they have available resources to solve an issue. And the feelings that they have about this and the feelings that they bring to us as frontline professionals are the important piece there. And how we react to the feelings that our clients, our survivors are bringing to us really depends on where we are as service providers in terms of our own feelings and our own coping mechanisms. So when I talk about affect infusion, affect infusion is sort of the umbrella term. It's a useful model, essentially. It describes the complex interactions that occur in our brains when we are talking about things like emotion and mood, and they directly impact our ability to process information. Affect has an effect that increases with the complexity of a task. And I will absolutely make that clearer in a moment. But what I'm saying is emotion and mood have an influence on our cognitive abilities. When we evaluate a situation, when we respond to a situation, when that situation is complicated, nuanced, or time sensitive, which are the qualities that we are dealing with when we are with somebody that we're serving that's in crisis. I put a formal definition. It's the process whereby effectively loaded information exerts an influence on and becomes incorporated into our judgmental process, entering into the judge, us, deliberations, and eventually coloring the outcome. If a situation requires substantive or systemic cognitive processing, there's a lot that we need to be able to take in and simultaneously process as we're working with a client or a patient or a survivor, where our decision making can be powerfully swayed by the emotions that we're being fed, essentially, by this person that we're working with. We can catch their emotions. So this isn't the best infographic to show this, but I wanted to at least attempt to make a simple full way of thinking about the stages in our thinking as providers that are swayed by affect infusion, that are swayed by mood and emotion. So attention is the first stage. We get bombarded by large amounts of information and stimuli, and we can't possibly, even in the best of times, not deal. We are at home, relaxed, completely at peace, well fed, feeling good. We still cannot process all of the information that is being presented to our brains. We can't possibly process all of that at once. We naturally have attention. We tend to focus on one or two subsets of all of the incoming information. We can switch gears. We can go, oh, now I smell something. But we tend to very much focus our information, right, based on whatever seems most important to us. Encoding. So as we focus our attention on a particular subset of data, we encode that information into a memory with more detail. Those memories, they are more richly encoded. The more detail, the more attention that we give to them, they're most easily retrieved, remembered, and accessed. And then that affect-directed attention to this encoding that makes certain memories most easily retrieved has a deep influence on how we interpret different complex situations. We make associations. Our brain makes shortcuts. We get schemas if you're familiar with neurobiology. And the results are, the influences are most pronounced when we're presented with situations that involve atypical, difficult, complex, layered, and nuanced situations. So what this tends to mean for us, the affect infusions that I work with my advocates most often on are social referencing and emotional contagion. Social referencing, if you've studied child development, you've probably heard of this a lot. It's frequently discussed in childhood development. It's rarely discussed when it comes to adult behavior, but it's really about how we take cues. So we social reference when we look at somebody else to gauge how we should react. We look at somebody's facial expressions, their gestures, we look at their, we read their body language, we listen to their tone of voice. It gives us clues on how to understand or respond to new or ambiguous situations. And then using that information, we calibrate how we respond, right? So we want to be in harmony, right, with how other people are responding, not just because we're polite, but because this is deeply, deeply embedded in our biology. So we reorient ourselves based on these visual cues. And I mean, this is, we know there are just certain things that we know and we participate in as part of a social contract. And this is how we learn those unspoken behaviors. Like, for instance, you get in an elevator and people face forward, face the door. It would be a little off-putting if somebody faced a different direction. There's nothing inherently wrong with facing another direction, but at some point we all learned that the way that you enter and hold space inside an elevator is we all face forward, waiting for the doors to open. We learn that kind of behavior from social referencing. emotional contagion. So it was actually only this idea has been around for as long as humans have been around, but the term was coined in 1988. So it talks about the tendency that we have to mimic one another, to mirror one another, particularly when we're involved in either a very ambiguous situation, a very charged situation, or a situation with a feeling of intimacy, which is what we run into when working with folks in crisis. Those situations can be ambiguous, hard to understand, emotionally charged, and have a certain amount of intimacy. So we tend to mimic and synchronize expressions, vocalizations, tones of voice, how the volume of your voice, our movements, in order to converge emotionally. So this is another way in which nonverbal cues, facial expressions, tone of voice, movement, which convey between folks something that is ambiguous or complicated or intimate. We tend to mirror it. That's just how we as humans deal with the situation. So I said this tendency is common. I mean, it's common with just humans, but you may find yourself when you're dealing with a very emotionally charged client, one that's escalated, agitated, angry, frustrated, or other, you may find yourself inadvertently matching the client's tone, volume, mannerisms, mirroring the state, what we interpret as their emotional state, and then personalizing their issue. So taking their issue onto ourselves. This is all natural. So as I'm talking about this, I'm not necessarily describing something that is negative. This was a really important evolutionary trait that helped us survive for millennia. We had to be able to come into novel situations, not just human created, and figure out how to respond. And so we look to each other to understand those, how we should be responding. Affect infusion, social referencing, and emotional contagion are natural. This is how we learn. It's an important part how we learn as children. Those of you that have kids, they mimic, they try on things, they dress up, this is how we do this, is they watch other people, they watch grown-ups, they watch other kids, they watch animals, and then they pretend. As we grow up, we still have these same impulses, and they're frequently subconscious. It's just an automatic imitation or response. It's just natural, and it all has to do with our mirror neurons. Mirror neurons, they are in the brain's premotor cortex. Sorry about that. They're a class of neuron, modulate their activity, both when we do a physical motor activity or when we observe somebody doing a physical motor activity. These neurons were really well studied in primates. Now they're fairly well studied in humans. And there's an intimate link in our brains between perception and action. Perception of a behavior, watching a behavior, triggers our own motor representation of that behavior. So you see somebody petting a cat, watching someone petting a cat actually triggers the motor representation in your brain of you petting a cat. So this mirror neuron system, I said premotor cortex, it's also in the inferior parietal. motor and somatosensory cortex. So we have an actual neural mechanism by which we understand one another's actions simply by watching. Mirror neurons are fired when goal-related actions are seen or performed by others. We understand what somebody is doing when they're petting a cat. We understand what somebody is doing when they're shooting a basketball. Our mirror neurons are fired during that activity. Research suggests emotions trigger a similar neurological response as a process of directing our experiential understanding. We understand how something feels, and so that also enters into this triggering. Mirror neurons and the neural activation of the limbic system synchronize what is being experienced and what is being perceived. So what we see and what we perceive, what we feel about what we're seeing based on encoded memories, which start from where we focus our attention, right? Where we focus our attention, what we most richly encode with details, that which becomes the easiest and fastest to access, which then drive our assessments of a situation, looking around, trying to gather information on how to respond to a complex, emotionally charged situation. Somebody is doing an activity, maybe they're crying, maybe they're angry, maybe they're stomping around. Our mirror neurons are fired. Our perception of what that means from our limbic system. And so now we have kind of this fantastic volcano of us remembering, feeling, and interpreting. So we adapt to emotional culture through these cues. The reflective behavior, right? Even when we're not thinking about it, it just has to do with these mirror neurons and helping to control the influx of information that we can process at a time. So it's an attempt to weed out all of the extraneous data because we get all kinds of data, and this is trying to glean it down, make our brains into better storytellers. We all know somebody who tells a story and they always include details that don't matter. They're talking about being chased by a dog and they tell you that they're running down a hallway and the dog is gaining on them and they pass a Pepsi machine and then they pass a Coke machine and then they pass 3 water fountains, and that has nothing to do with the story. So this is an attempt of our brain to do that same sort of editing, weeding out extraneous data and encoding what we believe to be the most meaningful data, encoding it so it is easily and quickly retrieved. And therefore, we could see these behaviors as being a precursor to empathy and compassion, right? This is how we understand what people are feeling. This is how we understand if somebody else is, in terms of crisis, in pain, whether they're escalated, they're upset, they are frightened, whatever. This is part of how we not only understand that's what they're feeling, but we have some empathy and compassion for what they're going through. And as we do this, we do change our affect to be more in line with what we observe. I mean, by matching and reflecting affect, we're more than able to imagine, right? We can, like I said, this is the development of empathy, but we can have compassion, right? And this is partially why we all do the work that we do. I mean, I don't do mine for the rockin' paycheck. I do it because I want to help others. I have a calling and a satisfaction in wanting to be of service to folks, and particularly be of service to folks who are having some of the worst days of their lives. So the fact that all of this sort of naturally happens in the brain, my brain, your brain, here I am saying catching crisis. So where's the danger? It sounds like this is all pretty great. Our brains are set up pretty naturally to be able to observe, emulate, personalize, and therefore have empathy and compassion for what somebody else is feeling. So, Caren, where's the danger in this? So, the dangers. Psychologist Joseph Paul Forgas, who is actually the one who first defined affect infusion as a model in the 90s. He stated, affect infusion is the process whereby effectively loaded information, right, exerts that influence and has a judgmental outcome. The key here is the social judgments we have to make consistently as frontline service providers and clinicians. Making that kind of social judgment not only requires us to observe physical actions, but to make some inferences. We have to be using and accessing some high-level cognitive functions, right? Which are going to affect how we proceed with responding to our client, survivor, patient. So while they help us empathize and feel compassion, the danger can also is that it can lead us to some bias, and it can close the door on some potential treatment or response options prematurely, where we make some decisions that may not be based on the fullest amount of information. Bias can look like taking on the crisis, swelling beyond empathy and compassion into personally feeling the crisis yourself. I see this one many, many, many times, even with extremely experienced advocates, taking on the success or failure of resolution of a crisis as something that you, as a provider, as an advocate, as a frontline worker, are directly involved, responsible for, and somehow it reflects on you. We've all felt that. There's always a client, there's always a story, there's always a survivor that hits us right in that place. Whether it's that it triggers some memories because we have lived experience, or there's just something about it that sticks. We all have this, and we all have the ability to feel the pain. But what I'm talking about here is really taking on the success or failure of this person coming out, resolving the crisis on you as a provider. That can lead to something like bending some rules. Crossing boundaries with good intention is still crossing boundaries. Doing something for one client that you wouldn't or don't do for another client. Helping clients when you're not at work. Releasing info to help somebody out without their permission, right? That sort of stuff. The impulse is there. The impulse is always there, particularly when you have a client that is maybe a little bit resistant, motivated, but resistant. Bending rules, we take on, believe it or not, even though we're bending rules, we're taking on a little bit of a parental role, and again, not letting the client drive. Escalating to escalate. I see this one a lot too. We want to show somebody that we care, we hear them, what they're going through matters to us. And so we we don't want to, we have rapport with them. We've spent time really developing a relationship and trust, and we don't want to be the one to deliver some bad news, whatever that bad news is. So what we do is we escalate just to escalate. So we can say to the person, oh yes, well I'm doing everything I can, but it's upstairs. Or we freeze. In the moment, can't think of an appropriate resource, or can't access our training, or can't remember what our agency policy is on something. And so we don't offer it, or we make something up on the spot. Or, we offer inappropriate referrals, which is another way of sort of not having to break bad news by simply handing our person off to somebody else to give them the bad news. So there's other ways. This is not a complete course on bias. It was just, these were three buckets I tend to see a lot. We think we know what more than we do. So the reason that that affect infusions can cause us to make some less than optimal decisions on how to follow up, how to treat, and how to respond to our clients in crisis is we can be fooled into thinking we know more than we do. So something about the way that they're presenting their crisis brings to mind an easily accessible encoded memory of something that happened to us in the past. So we tend to assume what we know and what other people know are the same thing. As we move through the world, we tend to think of people, each other, as peers who generally share the same experience. Now, I'm not talking about folks with, very, very wide, say, age gaps or things like that. But as we kind of move through the world, we tend to assume most people have the same basic sets of knowledge that we do. And so our perception of a behavior that triggers our own motor representation of that behavior and what it means and how we should respond could actually be pretty inaccurate. Big emotions we go down our personal rabbit holes. So as we go down our personal rabbit holes, we forget to actually pay attention to what our client thinks the crisis means and what they actually need to help resolve the crisis. Being trauma informed, being culturally competent, right? Because we believe that we understand exactly what's going on, what this means, and what kind of resolution this needs, that whatever the crisis is. We use what we feel to make decisions. So affect infusion processes influence decision making because we use emotions as a key source of information. There's also a lot of research that humans in general will do almost anything to attain relief from being uncomfortable. We see that in our clients, and our survivors, our patients, but it is the same holds true for us. We have a basic drive to alleviate immediate discomfort, often at the expense of long-term solutions. So sometimes, as we're triggered, our mirror neurons, our limbic system, we're uncomfortable. And so whether we realize it or not, we are going to be making decisions from a place that is going to attempt to alleviate our own discomfort as opposed to whatever this patient, client, or survivor needs. And of course, we disempower, right? We love to feel like we're helping. Like I said, I mean, that is one of the things that is most important to me about my work. I get a deep sense of satisfaction from feeling like I'm being of service. And we also get the same amount of pleasure from decisions that feel like helping, but aren't helping, right? So those decisions that we make that attempt to overcome immediate discomfort, either make our client, patient, survivor immediately happy by escalating to escalate, or giving them giving them some preferential treatment that we don't usually provide, crossing boundaries, or us responding in a way that we think that we understand the whole situation because of how we've been activated. We make some decisions that are going to relieve our own discomfort, thinking that's what's also going to relieve the discomfort of the person we're serving. But we know making decisions on behalf of clients, even ones that are in distress, even ones that say, I don't know what to do, you do it, or what would you do, or what do you think I should do? It also disempowers them and prolongs the crisis cycle. So a big important milestone in resolving a crisis cycle is empowering the person with resources, with a next step, with whatever it is, helping to guide them on their own path of resolving the crisis situation. And lastly, but not least, affect-infused reactions lead to burnout and vicarious secondary trauma. If you're feeling every crisis that comes across your plate, that is exhausting. So burnout and vicarious trauma are different. But essentially, burnout is overload, stress, commonly caused seen a lot, particularly with folks that work with folks that there's just chronic issues and chronic complex issues. Vicarious trauma is usually a response to a specific experience, usually shared with us. So, but both they can be quick onset, they can gradually progress, but essentially both of them are rooted in emotional exhaustion, which can also present as somatic symptoms: headaches, stomach aches, fatigue, nausea, all of it. And burnout and secondary trauma also lead to a decrease in concern and esteem for clients, which is natural. When your bucket's empty, you have nothing to pour into anybody else's bucket. And that's also going to decrease in the quality of the care that you can provide to the folks on your caseloads. So most of this won't be anything that you haven't heard before. Preventing burnout and vicarious trauma. The number one: self-care, self-care, self-care. A lot of messaging, a lot of marketing around self-care. And while spa days and binging, on a show with a lot of ice cream, whatever, is super nice, self-care needs to go deeper than that. It's not always fun. It's not always pleasurable, though it can be. And I will get a little bit more involved in self-care in just a moment. Secondly, supervision. If you have supervision at your agency or in your organization with either a supervisor or a peer group, that's great. That is a time in which you can talk through some of these issues. But if this isn't always available, there are tons of local, national organizations, lots that have online meetings that are peer-to-peer, right? And I'm not talking peer, like peer support or like certified peer advocates. But there are folks that peer-to-peer in your role, right? Or your general, depending peers, the people that are doing similar work to you. But having time, being able to safely process a lot of things that come up in our work, talking them through with somebody else in a trusted and confidential setting, does a lot of work with preventing burnout and vicarious trauma. Continuing education. Taking courses, reading books. I wanted to throw one title I really, really like and have found really helpful in doing this kind of work, not just on preventing affect infusions, but just in self-care in general, which is Trauma Stewardship by Laura Van Dernoot-Lipsky. It's a great one. But the more that we understand the way our brains work and how our work affects us, demystifies it, and we start to bring more and more tools to the table, both for taking care of ourselves and for taking care of our clients. And then, of course, this is the one that we all have the least amount of power over, but agency policy. So having a workplace culture that values self-care, that allows for time off, that allows for time for supervision, and of course, in a perfect world, reasonable limits on caseload size. That I just wanted to throw that out there because even though that's not something that you may have a lot of immediate effect over, it is an environment that helps build a work-life balance that is designed for sustainability in this work. So what to do in the moment? So self-regulatory techniques you can use. Getting caught up in somebody's story, totally natural. The most important skill to practice is self-awareness. As you listen to something that feels really high impact or really emotionally charged, just notice what you're doing. Notice your posture, your breathing, your heart rate. Some people feel warm when I get flushed cheeks. But just initially start to practice taking a second and just noticing what your own body is doing during emotionally charged moments. And you don't have to do this necessarily at work. You can do this, you're, binging a new show and it's really emotionally intense. Take a second to, oh, this is really emotionally intense. What am I doing? So just being able to get into the habit of having, this is really emotional. I am going to check in with myself silently just for a second is the first invaluable tool. Because that will allow you to do some really important, really simple self-regulatory techniques that will help you when your brain is getting pulled into reacting or mirroring a really highly emotional story, which is pause. There is nothing wrong. I tell my advocates this all the time. There is nothing wrong with taking a second. Even in a really emotionally charged moment, whether if you're in person, say, hey, how about do you want a glass of water? How about a cup of tea? Offer the person something. You're not abandoning them, right? But this allows you to take a moment, step back, and gather your thoughts. If you are like at the DV Hopeline, most of our work is on the phone and some of it is in chat. It's also okay to say to somebody, hey, I just need a second to look something up. I am just going to put you on hold for a minute. Okay. We don't put them on hold for 10 minutes. We put them on hold for a minute. Nobody is going to really flip out being on hold for a minute as long as you explain to somebody what you're doing, why you're doing it, and you honor their time. But having that just couple of seconds to go, okay, what's going on? What am I going to do next? You know, what's affecting me? Just doing that check-in. Second, restate in your own words, of course, right? And this is classic active listening. Nothing anybody has never heard before, right? Just going and telling people back in your own words what they've said to you. Now, that does a few things. It absolutely, right, promotes that you are listening, people are heard, you're validating your understanding, but you're also creating another layer of experience to the situation. So you're not immediately hearing the situation, seeing somebody's body movement, having your mirror neurons activated, and then responding. You're adding another layer. So you're making sure that you understand what you think that you understand, and maybe you don't. Be curious. Also, always just a piece of really good advice in our work in general. Open-ended questions. What's worked? What hasn't worked? If you find yourself wanting to prescribe a particular course of action in a crisis situation, ask them, you know, before you start prescribing or recommending, make sure that you have explored with them what has worked and what hasn't worked and why they think it didn't work. Listen, of course, again, what's being said, what's not being said, what's being offered, what's being held back. That's easier to do. Listen, then take that pause, right? And go, okay, what has been said? Is there anything that's missing? You know, and then restate and be curious. So you can move between these techniques and breathe. You know, again, coming back to that check-in, mindfulness, do a silent body scan. Are your shoulders hunched? Are you leaning in? What's going on with you? And you can just take a second and even just changing your posture back to being relaxed, sitting back in your chair, something like that can help change and stop and self-regulate in that moment and bring you back into the actual present with what is being told to you, as opposed to us getting caught up in our affect, in you know, getting an affect infusion and getting caught up in what we think is happening. And I told you I'd circle back to self-care. Self-care critical, right? We know this. Tending to self helps us attend to emotions. Fun night out. I mean, I feel like I should make a t-shirt. It's like, it's not always fun. Can be fun. It's not always fun. And then I really, really love this because people go, well, what is it then? And it's these things. Sometimes it's saying no. It's staying at home. It's asking for what you need. It's taking a step back. It's forgiving yourself. It's doing your taxes. It's doing your laundry. It's making sure that your life at home is attended to so you can feel safe and rejuvenated on your own time, whatever that is, right? Whatever that takes. It's just not always ice cream and, you know, binging Supernatural, although I'm a big fan of that. But sometimes it's about attending to our own emotional, fiscal, and physical health. So when we do go into working with folks in crisis, we're also not sitting in the chair across from them, potentially towing the edge of crisis ourselves. So, you know, whatever that hard work is, and it may be going out dancing, it may be taking a class, but A lot of times it's also these things, and these are not, this is not exhaustive, but I love this because these are some of the hard and less way less fun things to do that can be a really, really important part of taking care of our own mental health, taking care of our own emotional health, so we can continue to do this work and have it be sustainable. So, thank you very much. So that is my presentation. I just wanted to see if there were some questions that came up during while I was talking, to see if there was anything I could answer.
All right, so it doesn't look like anything came up. Somebody
Okay.
did who joined late asked about um if it was related to the phenomenon of vicarious trauma, but then they messaged later and said that it was
Yep.
answered.
Yeah. Okay. Well, great. Is there anybody who's still on that has a question or something that they wish that I had addressed more and maybe didn't address, or something that you wanted to share about the phenomenon, anything like that?
Katie said, very helpful, specific, and direct presentation. I appreciate
Thank you.
it.
Thank you, Katie. Thank you.
But yeah, it doesn't seem like there are any questions. A lot of
Okay.
people saying thank you. I
Well,
know I learned a lot. I'm not a clinician, but if I were, this would be it'll be helpful in my daily life, I think, a little bit too. But
and it's something, because we all come to this work, right? I always say that, like, I'm not doing this work because of the rockin' paycheck. I mean, God bless the paycheck. I'm not killing the paycheck, right? But we get called to this work for a lot of reasons, whether it's lived experience, there's people in our family that have lived experience, or, just wanting to be of some sort of service to other people. And that whole driving force, right? That empathy, that compassion, thinking about it actually as potentially having a negative side where we get so invested in a story and so, personally involved in helping somebody that it actually can stand in the way of providing really good care, is always a really interesting conversation to have. And I feel like we need to have it over and over and over again, because it's not something that goes away. I mean, we just continue to work with people that are gonna right, our clients are gonna touch us, and that's we want that, but we also want to make sure we're able to sit in a position where we can both have compassion, empathy, and deliver service, and go home and not be completely wrecked and exhausted, and then we burn out and there's turnover, right? Because then we all know that, right? We burn out, there's turnover. Now our clients have a new person that they're starting all over with, and it's rough. And so we definitely have, yeah, I'm an evangelist for this conversation. So again, I wanna reemphasize, if there's something that you wish that you had asked that you think of later, feel free to shoot me an email. My email's on the PDF of the slides, which you are also welcome to, and Marla has got them. So
yes. And Ralph just messaged, the recognition of how we can get sucked into our clients' emotional distress is an important reminder for us all. Thank you. And
yeah.
lots of great presentations and
Oh,
thank yous
good.
coming in. So if folks want to stick around for just a few more minutes, I'm going to go over some last minute housekeeping items. Thank you, Caren, again for this great presentation.
Thank you for having me.
We'd like to remind all participants that a PDF of today's PowerPoint, along with the recording of today's presentation, will be uploaded to the webinar library located on iRetta's website sometime within the next week. Once we have these resources posted, a link will be sent out to all of today's webinar registrants. I now want to remind you of our evaluation and CEU process. You will receive you'll receive one follow-up email from us. It will include a link to the evaluation and step-by-step instructions for how to obtain your CEUs. Please note that it will take up to 48 hours for your CEUs to become available because we have to cross-check your attendance records. We would like to request that you fill out our evaluation. It should take no longer than 2 minutes of your time. And again, we want to thank everyone for taking time out of your day to participate. If you have any questions at all, please email us. The email address is info@iretta.org. And with that, Caren, thanks so much. I will conclude today's webinar.
Thank you.
You're welcome.